Well, it's great to be back home in Texas. This morning, I went by Dell, toured the facilities there, met with senior leadership at Dell. This afternoon, I'm looking forward to being at UT for the ROTC commissioning ceremony. This past week in Washington has been busy. The week began with my pressing the United States Senate to investigate what happened in Benghazi. Obviously, the House of Representatives has created a select committee. On Monday, I went to the Senate floor and asked unanimous consent for the Senate to create a select committee, a joint committee to work with the House. The House is doing its job. It seems to me the Senate should do our job as well, because there are many unanswered questions on the Senate floor. I laid out 10 questions that still haven't been answered, basic questions such as why the State Department repeatedly turned down requests for additional security in Benghazi, why there weren't military assets in place to prevent the attack on September 11th, a date we should have known was heightened risk, why no military response was sent in during the attack to save the 4 Americans whose lives were tragically lost, why the administration systematically went to the American people with a story that the attack was not motivated by radical Islamic terrorism, that was contrary to what the evidence on the ground suggested, and why in the year and a half that's followed, none of the terrorists have been apprehended, prosecuted, or killed. In response to my asking for unanimous consent for a select committee on Benghazi, Democrat Senator Bob Menendez came to the Senate floor and he objected. And we actually had about a half-hour colloquy on the Senate floor. It was a shocking thing that occurred, actual debate on the Senate floor. Most Senate speeches now are one senator speaking to an empty chamber. You had 2 senators engaging in some back and forth debate, which I think was very productive and revealing. And Senator Menendez stood up and he repeated the Democratic talking points that Democratic members of Congress are saying on any television show that will put them on, which is, he said, all the questions have been answered. There have been too many hearings already. We don't need to know anything more about what happened in Benghazi. And in my floor speech, I outlined 10 questions that haven't been answered. And so as we engaged in debate, I pointed out that nowhere in his remarks had Senator Menendez even attempted to answer any of the 10 questions I laid out. And indeed, I responded with a very simple one. A very simple question. Did President Obama sleep on the night of September 11th, 2012? Now, that's a binary question. Yes or no is the answer. And I would note that when President Obama was running for office, Hillary, her lead attack on President Obama is, would he be ready to answer the phone at 3 a.m. when a national security crisis hit? And I pointed out that I thought it was likely Senator Menendez would not be able to answer that question because the White House won't answer that question. Senator Menendez's response, I think, was very revealing. In response to that, he said he didn't know if President Obama slept on the night of September 11th, 2012. But he went on to say he had no idea if anyone told President Obama about the terrorist attack while it was ongoing. And he went on even further to say he had no idea if there was anything President Obama could have done during the attack to save the lives of those 4 Americans. It was a stunning admission. It was the most significant news concerning Benghazi made last week, was Senator Menendez's admission on the Senate floor. And my response, I thank the senior senator from New Jersey for his powerful speech in support of creating a select committee on Benghazi in the Senate. Because if the Democratic senator who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee has no idea, in his own words, whether the president was told about the terrorist attack, and has no idea whether there was anything the president could have done to save those 4 Americans, that underscores the need for a fair inquiry, an impartial inquiry into what happened. Learn the facts, why 4 Americans were killed, why the first U.S. ambassador was killed in service since the 1970s, and why in the 20 months that followed we have 4 dead Americans and 0 dead terrorists. Why no one has been apprehended. You know, we all remember the fall of 2012 when, in a debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, President Obama got emotional, he got angry. He said, nobody cares more about Benghazi and the Americans who were killed than I do. And it's striking. You know, I'll take President Obama at his word that he was speaking truthfully when he said that. But it's striking. In 20 months, it seems that was the last time he ever mentioned the word Benghazi, other than to dismiss it as not being worth inquiring into. We need to get to the truth. I think it is unfortunate that the Democrats, rather than join together in a bipartisan way to address national security, instead they're engaged in partisan stonewalling. Two other issues from this week. The FCC is going forward with its proposals on net neutrality, and I have made clear my strong opposition to the federal government regulating the internet. The last thing we want is a bunch of unelected bureaucrats in Washington putting roadblocks, putting federal regulations in the way of freedom on the internet. You know, the internet has been an entrepreneurial haven, a haven from taxes, from regulations. It has created, number one, an abundance of free speech, but also an incubator for small businesses, a new opportunity that's generated jobs. And the biggest thing that could screw it up is Washington getting their fingers in the middle of it. So I'm hopeful the FCC will back off their efforts to misuse their statutory authority to get into the business of regulating the internet. And indeed, I'll be introducing legislation to make clear the FCC doesn't have the authority to regulate the internet. The internet should be free, and it should be an entrepreneurial haven to anyone who wants to build a business and create opportunity. The final thing I'll mention is I spent a good chunk of this week doing what I have done for the last couple of months, which is focusing on energy and the American energy renaissance that we are experiencing in this country. It is the one bright spot in an otherwise dismal Obama economy. For 5 years, we've been trapped in the great stagnation, stagnant economic growth, and yet at the same time, we are experiencing an American energy renaissance that came from the private sector. It came from Texas, came from entrepreneurs risking capital. It has transformed our domestic economic terrain. Indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a Senate floor speech on energy and talking about the president's proposal to raise the minimum wage. Now, raising the minimum wage is an issue that on the surface polls pretty well. And the Democrats were pretty candid. That's why they were doing it. They said, admittedly, it polls well. We want to vote on this because we think it's a good issue to go run campaign attack ads on. But I'll tell you, the floor speech I gave had three numbers. Number one, it had $10.10, which is the minimum wage the president says he wants to raise the minimum wage to. And by the way, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said if President Obama succeeded in jacking up the minimum wage, that up to 1 million people would lose their jobs as a direct consequence. This is the nonpartisan CBO. And by the way, the people who would lose their jobs are the most vulnerable among us. Many of them are young people, are teenagers, African Americans, Hispanics, people who are struggling to just start climbing the economic ladder. People, frankly, like my dad. 57 years ago when he fled Cuba and was washing dishes for 50 cents an hour, those are the people who would be hurt, thrown out of their jobs if the minimum wage were raised as President Obama wants. But the second number I put up was $0.00. Because $0.00 is the real Obama minimum wage. We have the lowest labor force participation since 1978. Millions of Americans are out of a job because of an administration that has $1.7 trillion in new taxes, crushing regulations that are hammering small businesses. And for all the millions of Americans who've lost their jobs because of the failed Obama economic policy, the real Obama minimum wage is $0.00 an hour. And then the third number I put up was $46.98. $46.98 is the average hourly wage for an oil and gas worker in North Dakota. North Dakota, the Bakken Field, is experiencing an incredible energy renaissance driven in many ways by Texas entrepreneurs. And what I said on the Senate floor is I want to see millions more people getting $40, $50, $60 an hour jobs and millions fewer trapped at $0 an hour because of the failed Obama economic policy. And that's why I've introduced comprehensive energy legislation, the American Energy Renaissance Act, to remove government barriers to developing our energy resources, to open up new federal lands so that we can create millions of high-paying jobs from the private sector. My top priority in office is focused on one thing, and that's restoring economic growth. And the reason is simple. That's the top priority of 26 million Texans, the 26 million Texans I work for. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Senator Governor Perry has traveled the country talking about the success, economic success in Texas, including the energy renaissance that you talk about. He points to the fact that he's been governor for 10 years and this has happened under his tenure. Is the economic success of Texas, including the energy renaissance we've seen here, is that something that Rick Perry is responsible for?
I am a big fan of Rick Perry. I like our governor very much. I think he's been a strong, effective governor. But let me tell you something. There isn't a politician in this country who's responsible for the economic growth we have. The economic growth has come from the private sector. It's come from entrepreneurs. Nothing drives me crazier than politicians who run around talking about the jobs they've created. Politicians are very good at killing jobs, but they don't create jobs. Now, I will give Governor Perry credit. I will give the state legislature credit for enacting laws that create an environment that allows small businesses to prosper and flourish, for not screwing it up. I mean, if you look at what's happening at the federal government would be much, much better. The rest of the country would be much, much better following the economic policies of Texas, of low taxes, low regulations, an environment where small businesses can prosper. But we should all be very clear, the jobs are not created by politicians. They're created by the private sector. Let's take, for example, the energy renaissance we're experiencing right now. In the past decade, the energy prospects of this country have changed fundamentally. And they've changed because of the shale revolution. For decades, we've known that there were enormous reserves of oil and natural gas trapped in shale. And conventional wisdom, everyone said you couldn't get it. There was no cost-effective way to extract that oil and gas, so don't worry about it. The energy renaissance we're experiencing didn't come from government. It wasn't studies at the Department of Energy. It wasn't a Washington think tank. It came from the private sector, and if you were, in fact, to identify one person more than anyone else directly responsible for the incredible energy economic boom we're experiencing right now, it would be George Mitchell, a Houston energy entrepreneur, the son of an immigrant, who invested vast amounts of money in experimenting with fracking, a long-used technology, but finding new ways to do so. And I'll make a point, Wayne. There's no state in the Union other than Texas where the energy renaissance could have been born. Think for a second where George Mitchell did this. George Mitchell was like a modern-day Hank Rearden. He stood up against all the conventional wisdom, everything that was said, this is hopeless, this is a waste of money, you're crazy. And he experimented with new ways to access those resources in the Barnett Shale under Dallas and Fort Worth, two major metropolitan areas. Can you imagine for a second if anyone had tried to do that in San Francisco or in New York? To go and say, okay, we're going to drill down, we're going to go horizontal, we're going to frack the heck out of it, extract those resources and do it under a major metropolitan area with over 6 million people living there. They would have been laughed out of the room. But that came from the private sector. That's where job creation comes from. What we need to do is remove the government barriers to small businesses, because 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. And that's what Washington should be focused on doing.
Senator,
can you talk about your trip to Ukraine?
Do you take anything away from the Republican primary results we've seen so far in Texas, in the legislature? We've seen a lot of far-right Tea Party candidates win their races or advance to runoffs, contrary to what we've seen in some other principal states this year.
Astonishingly, I agree with Scott.
Of course you do.
I would not agree with your labeling. What I would say is this. I'm encouraged by the primary results we saw earlier this year. I think Texans want principled leaders who will listen to the people and who will address the serious fiscal and economic problems we have, who will focus on economic growth. and who will defend the Constitution. And I've said many, many times, with respect to Washington, that the greatest divide we have in this country, it's not between Republicans and Democrats. It is between entrenched politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. And what I'm encouraged by is the last round of primaries in Texas, we saw over and over again voters saying they wanted to elect people who are going to listen to the people, who are not going to become captive to the lobbyists and entrenched special interest on all sides, and both parties fall victim to this. But instead, they want principled leaders who will listen to the people. I think that's a tremendous development for the state of Texas.
Talk about your trip to Ukraine. What are you going to do when you get there? What do you expect to see?
Well, I'm very excited to have the opportunity in a couple of weeks to travel to Ukraine, to travel to Eastern Europe, to travel to Israel. And the purpose of going is really to listen and to learn. There's no doubt Ukraine right now is a very troubled region. It is a region that has been subject to unprovoked aggression and indeed acts of war from Russia, as Russia has invaded Crimea, has seized the land. And I'll be traveling there shortly after the presidential election. Hopefully the election will proceed as scheduled, that Russia will not actively disrupt the election. And the purpose of going is really to sit down with government leaders, with religious leaders, with business leaders, with opposition leaders, and listen firsthand to the challenges they're facing. I have been quite vocal in criticizing the Obama administration's approach to foreign policy generally and to Ukraine and Russia in particular.
What do you think about Russia's, if you could call it, counter sanctions now, talking about not allowing U.S. astronauts to use their rockets to get back up there?
Look, Vladimir Putin is not a complicated man to figure out. He is a KGB thug. He is essentially a petro-tyrant. I like the phrase my colleague John McCain has used describing Russia as a gas station with a nation attached. He is using their energy resources to fund military aggression. And Putin has been very candid about his objective. He describes the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times. I think it's the greatest victory for freedom of modern times. But Putin has not hidden his desire to reassemble as much of the former Soviet Union as possible. And unfortunately, the Obama administration's foreign policy has been for the United States to recede from world leadership. We have stepped back from world leadership, and into that vacuum have stepped nations like Russia, like Iran, like China, leading from behind, which is how the Obama administration describes their foreign policy, is a self-contradictory notion. And when America doesn't lead, the world has become a more dangerous place. I cannot tell you how many ambassadors of foreign nations, foreign ministers of foreign nations, of allies, strong allies of ours, have come to my office, have pulled me aside in Washington, and have said essentially, where is America? What happened? How can we stand with America if we can't count on America to stand with us? And the policy of the Obama administration for 6 years has been to abandon and alienate our friends, and unfortunately to demonstrate weakness and coddle our enemies. I think that is sorely mistaken.
Senator,
I want to ask you about the commencement today. You're speaking to the ROTC. What advice do you have for young people going into the military?
Well, military service is one of the most noble, one of the highest callings that any young man or woman can aspire to. And the biggest reason I'm going to the ROTC commissioning ceremony today is to thank them. To thank them for their service, for their commitment, for their willingness to risk their lives, standing up to defend each and every one of us, standing up to defend our liberties. You know, my predecessor in the Senate, Kay Bailey Hutchison, over 2 decades earned a reputation as a fierce and relentless defender of the men and women of the military. And that is a legacy I very much hope to carry on and continue. You know, just in recent weeks, I unfortunately had traveled twice to Fort Hood following the tragic shooting there. And those were not the ideal circumstances to visit the men and women of our military. But I'll tell you, even in the midst of tragedy, even in the midst of the hurt and the tears that were shed at Fort Hood, the experience was inspiring. Because as I had the opportunity to visit quietly with young soldiers, I remember one young soldier in particular who'd been shot twice, shot in the arm, shot in the abdomen. He was there with his fiancée. He was there with his mom and his sister. And we walked in, and this young soldier spotted on General Milley's uniform, General Milley's the commanding officer at Fort Hood, spotted a Ranger patch. And this young soldier pointed at the patch and said, "General, I want to be a Ranger." This was 36 hours after he'd been shot twice. He's recuperating from surgery in the hospital, and the only thought he had is he wanted to go to Ranger School and fight even harder to protect our country. And our prayers are with the families of those soldiers who were killed, the families and all of the soldiers who were wounded. But at the same time, it's uplifting the incredible bravery on a daily basis the men and women of the military provide. And I will note that no state has a greater commitment to the military. No state produces more soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines than the state of Texas. And so this afternoon I look forward to just thanking those young cadets and congratulating them.
Senator, it's no secret that you've had, Senator, it's no secret that you've had a history with Dan Patrick and clashing with him 2 years ago. What do you make of the revelations about his mental health issues and the fact that that's become an issue in the race?
Look, I'm going to stay out of the lieutenant governor's race. I trust the grassroots voters to make a determination. I would encourage every candidate in that race and every other race to stay positive, to not traffic in the personal attacks that have become so commonplace in politics, that make people so fed up, so frustrated with politicians. And I would encourage every candidate, if you're running for office, if you're running in the runoff, present your own record, your own positive vision for the direction Texas should go, and draw a contrast with your opponent on substance, on policy. Policy is fair game. If you disagree on a policy question, if your policy record is different, that's fair game. But I would encourage every candidate running for office, don't traffic in the business of personal destruction.
Now, Ken Paxton is using your image in an ad right now. Are you okay with that? And would you like to see him victorious in this runoff?
I am staying out of a great many races. I think well of Ken. I've said that publicly before, but I'm going to trust the grassroots voters to make their determination.
No
Senator,
problem.
we gotta go.
There's a privately funded high-speed rail project from Dallas to Houston. It's about to go under federal review. If it goes through, Texas will have the first high-speed rail in the country. Do you support that project?
The best words you said there were privately funded. And when it comes to privately funded, I believe that citizens in the private sector are a lot better at deciding how to allocate their capital, how to assess the costs and benefits, than is the federal government. If the federal government does it, we end up with a whole lot more cylinders. If the private sector decides it wants to fund a project, terrific for them. I don't think the federal government ought to be spending billions of taxpayer dollars on projects that are not economically viable.
All right, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.